Our Christian education time on Reformation Sunday, led by the Reverend Jessica Tate. If you have not had a chance to sign in, please do so on the way out this morning. And I know I am welcoming those of you who are live streaming our Christian education, as well as these have been by Zoom. So we know many of you are live streaming, and welcome to those of you who are in the sanctuary as well. Pastor Scott is not here this morning. He had a call on Friday from the hospice workers where his father is, that his father was declining quite rapidly in health and was experiencing jaundice and possible liver failure. So he drove down. He is with his dad right now, who was responsive yesterday, and we will let the congregation know as we know more. So we hold George Ramsey and Pastor Scott in our prayers this morning. And I'm glad that this is live streamed and recorded, because he was very excited to have Reverend Jessica Tate be here with us for this presentation. She is the pastor at one of the pastors at Georgetown Presbyterian Church, and her special focus is in mission and vision, and how the church can look at the mission of Jesus Christ and their specific mission in their neighborhood and implement that. And so that is her current call. Prior to that, she served as 9 years as the founding director of Next Church, which is an organization that I know is throughout the country, connected with other countries outside the country as well, not too much. And I looked up one of the main parts of the organization, and it is an organization dedicated to providing a space for sparking imagination, telling the truth, working for justice, and pouring into church leaders in this time when the church as an institution is precarious. So Jessica's had experience traveling all around the country, meeting with church leaders who are asking this very question, and then imagining together what the body of church looks like in today's culture and context. So we warmly welcome Reverend Jessica Tate for our CE time this morning.
Thank you, Jen. It's really great to be with you all, and a warm welcome both to those in the room and also those who are with us online. It's good to see your faces this morning, or at least this much of them. So I want to talk this morning about this question: is faith still possible in the context of the 21st century North American church? And I need to give credit to my preaching and worship professor, Dr. Ron Byers, for raising this question. He wrote a book in 2019 that was called Believer on Sunday, Atheist by Thursday: Is Faith Still Possible? He's particularly interested in what he calls the classic faith of the ecumenical church. So the Catholic, by which he means the universal church, the evangelical, so sharing the good news of the gospel, and the reforming, the ever-evolving faith that we hold as good Presbyterians. And Dr. Byers articulates that the mainline Protestant faith itself is caught between this interesting place where we are in the midst of aggressive and reactionary evangelicalism and on one hand, and religious skepticism on the other hand. So he asks, is it possible to have faith in God when so many who claim faith do so aggressively, immodestly, and with apparently little respect for those who do not share it? He notes that most of us who are in mainline Protestant congregations, if we're forced to choose between that aggressive evangelical kind of faith or religious skepticism, most of us choose religious skepticism. And as a result, we've sort of unintentionally watered down our theology, our discipleship, and our witness in the world. So he asks again, is Christian faith of an intellectually serious and recognizably generous sort still possible in our world today? Spoiler alert, yes, is the answer to the question, but it's going to take some work on our part to recover that kind of faith. I want to tell you a little bit more about myself. Thank you, Jen, for that lovely introduction. But just so you know a little bit more about who I am as I'm speaking to you, I am a Presbyterian minister's daughter. I grew up as a child with a Southern Presbyterian church, and my mother has worked in education for a long time, so ended up a good blend of the two of them. My husband was a Christmas and Easter kind of Christian growing up, so it was a privilege of mine when we got together that I got to watch him be baptized as an adult. And now we're raising a 3-year-old son who we're trying to figure out how do we raise this child in faith, particularly in a largely for that age group still virtual church world. I cut my teeth as a pastor in Fairfax, Virginia, where I served the Fairfax Presbyterian Church. And then, as Jen said, have spent the last 9 years touring the country in conversation with folks about these very questions, some of these big systemic level questions about our faith and where God is calling us now. I do still very much believe that there is a place in this world for this kind of classical faith that Dr. Byers is commending to us and is calling us back to, and a kind of faith that I believe still has deep, deep resonance for a culture. We need hope and love and peace and grace in this world, perhaps more than ever, or at least it feels that way to me on a daily basis. So I do hope that the answer to this question is yes. That we can have a faith that's intellectually serious and recognizably generous in our culture. So we're going to look at faith first this morning and the different definitions of faith, not all of them, but just some thoughts about them. The Greek word for faith is pistis, which at its root means trust. Often in our age of church life, we have come to equate faith with belief, when the actual roots of the word are trust. And that is sort of a nuanced distinction, but I think one that is important as we think about the acts in our lives that demonstrate trust versus an intellectual assent to something. It's much more about a full, embodied, holistic experience of how we're living our lives as people of faith than just what we say we believe or something we can check off in a box for a couple of hours on Sunday morning. John Calvin said this about faith: faith is the firm and certain knowledge of God's benevolence toward us, founded upon the truth of the freely given promise in Christ, both revealed to our minds and sealed upon our hearts through the Holy Spirit. And he goes on to say, and I think this is important, but we shrink from genuine knowledge of God's benevolence toward us because we turn away from God by making idols and claiming responsibility for our own gifts. And therefore, he says, we need special revelation in Scripture. And that second part, I think, is important because it calls us back to how we come to know God, which is through Scripture in the Reformed tradition, and also because it reminds us continually of our propensity to turn away from God, to get captivated by other forces in the world that are so compelling and are designed to be so compelling to us, to fall short of this living toward this God's benevolence toward us. And Ron Byers adds to this conversation, saying that faith is the ongoing process of engagement of a kind that is holistic, with body, mind, and spirit. So we as Presbyterians usually excel at faith from here up. We're really good at the mind part, and we're less good at the body and spirit part. So I think that's one of the challenges before us, as to how to integrate our faith a little bit more holistically than we have traditionally done. And Byers goes on to say, faith involves the coordination of imagination, sensing, emotional intelligence, intuition, assisted by observation and informed reasoning. And to be sustained, it requires community. So if we think about that for just a second, let's use our brains again to think about it and recognize just how many of those pieces, imagination, sensing, emotional intelligence, those need also to be fundamental and formational in our education programs, in our formation programs, in our worship experiences. And too often we have, I think, privileged just the intellectual part. So that's one of the major challenges for us today. So why is this kind of faith hard in our society today? Byers argues that one of the main reasons is that the Enlightenment presuppositions have narrowed the way we permit ourselves to engage the world. And he says that this narrowing consists of shutting down the respect that we have for our innate inborn capacity for engaging the world holistically, for taking seriously the sort of precognitive ways that contribute to a healthy access to the whole of our environment, including the part that is not expressible in words. And in the Enlightenment and the thinking thereafter, we became suspicious of a whole category of experience that might accurately be described as one way of knowing things. So he talks about two different ways of seeing, that faith is confidence, that there are dimensions of reality that, while invisible, are equally as important as those that are visible. And sometimes those invisible things are even more important. Think about the sacraments. That's what we're claiming in the sacraments, right? That the sacraments are a visible sign of God's invisible grace. So we believe that as Presbyterians. It's part of our theology, but we don't always internalize that, Byers argues, because we've been captive to this Enlightenment way of thinking. So he says the culture of the past 400 years has brought many, many good things, but it has also nearly incapacitated our ability to make use of the intuitive skills as we process the imagines and affirmations of the gospel. Everything must fit expectations formed by the scientific method rather than this precognitive, intuitive kind of knowing. And he cites, in the last meal, Jesus said, "Do this," not explain this, which, thank goodness, because how do we explain it ultimately? So he's arguing that we have muted this precognitive sense of knowing our experiences and our exposure to things. And so our explanations have become more important than experience. And I want to be quick to add that he is not arguing that experience take place of reason and rationality. He's just wanting to elevate it into line with that kind of reason and rationality. Secondly, he's arguing that our faith is not fragile, but that it is strengthened where it finds support. That goes back to being in community. And one of the shifts that has happened in our cultural life is that the culture is no longer supporting our faith in ways it has. It is still, Christianity, we are still by far the most deferred to religion in this country. But it is not deferred to in ways it has been in years past. You can think, I can remember, changes in my lifetime of how that has shifted. I'm sure you can as well. We can think about Sundays not being as sacred anymore. Soccer fields and brunch options have way more traffic than our sanctuaries on a Sunday morning. And Christianity has become one of many religious options, including no religious option for people in our culture, and that's seen as acceptable. When I was a child in North Carolina, if you didn't go to church on Sunday, you didn't tell anybody that. It was not socially acceptable. And this might make it harder on us because we're not the only game in town anymore, but it also means that the church itself, we now have to bear the responsibility for our faith, for living it out, for communicating it to the community, for raising our children in it. So perhaps for too long, we've been propped up by the culture in a way that ultimately didn't serve us. And now we have to figure out how to stand on our own feet and stand on the witness of the gospel to bear the weight of the faith and the sharing and continuation of the faith. So now we must be compelling and winsome in ways that we used to just get to assume. And that's ultimately, I think, a good thing, even though it's throwing us for a loop right now. There's also a lot of, so there's two things there, the sort of Enlightenment thinking, and then the culture shifting away from buttressing up our faith. And then there are other big cultural forces that are at work too. We could do a whole class just on these forces, but just to say a few things about them. I commend this book, The Unwinding, to you if you've not read it. It's from 2013, so it's getting a little bit dated at this point, but I still think just makes the case so clearly. George Packer I'm going to read you one short few sentences from this book. He talks about this great unwinding that has happened in our culture, and he says this: if you were born around 1960 or afterward, you have spent your adult life in the vertigo of an unwinding. You watch structures that had been in place before your birth collapse like pillars of salt across the visible landscape. The farms of the Carolina Piedmont, the factories of Mahoning Valley, Florida subdivisions, California schools, and other things, harder to see but no less vital in supporting the order of everyday life, have changed beyond our recognition. Ways and means in Washington caucus rooms, taboos on New York trading desks, manners and morals everywhere. When the norms that made the old institution useful began to unwind and the leaders abandoned their post, the Roosevelt Republic that had reigned for almost half a century came undone. The void was filled by the default force in American life, organized money. I think he so succinctly captures there just some of the dramatic shifts that we've seen over the last 50 years or so. And I want to add to that, the unwinding that we're seeing is not all bad. We've seen an increase in civil rights for women, for the LGBTQ community, and ultimately, hopefully, it's even beneficial for white males as the dominant social roles are breaking down, so we have more freedom to be equitable in our relationships and in our parenting and our family structures. But nonetheless, there has been a huge shift in our common life. And the church is not immune from this, particularly the part about old institutions becoming less useful to people. And that's one of our challenges, is to figure out what is our use to people when it's not self-evident to them. A second major change is technology and information. So if you think about how you communicated as a child, we wrote letters. I wrote letters to my friends. I played with the kids on the block. I got a cell phone after college. So we have changed significantly in how we communicate with one another. And digital information has grown tenfold in the last 5 years. Today, this statistic baffles me. Today, a person is subjected to more information in a day than a person in the Middle Ages had in their entire lifespan. So in a day, we are inundated with information, much of which we can't do anything about. So it has this interesting paralyzing effect. David Lose, who's a biblical scholar and homiletician, talks about digital pluralism that we've come into, a world in which there are multiple and competing realities, stories, convictions, perspectives, and worldviews, most of which are mediated in this digital means. So it's not that we're getting our news from the local newspaper or from people down the block or even our local politicians. We're getting all of that information through digital means. And the major impact of this is that there's too much available to us. And so the new skill that is being required of us day in, day out is judgment over what to do with this abundance of choice that we have and scarce resources that we have. So David Lose talks about, I haven't double-checked his math on this, but he says that if you go to Starbucks right now and want to place an order, you have 78,000 possible combinations for what you can get. If you look at size and the different syrups you can add in and the different kinds of milk. And I think it's only increased with the different kinds of milk now that you can put in. We have an abundance of choice even for our coffee beverages. Far more than our grandparents had, and certainly generations before that. And in this reality, time has become the most scarce resource because of this abundance of choice. Decision fatigue is real just in our daily existence. And the bad news about this is that church has become a choice rather than an expectation. But the good news is, how do we choose? That's a major question that thoughtful people are thinking through all the time. And the church has some really good resources for helping us live with an abundance of choice. Discernment, Sabbath keeping, Christian values in the best sense of that phrase, those are some of the things we hopefully excel at. So hopefully we do have some things that are particularly relevant to the kind of swirl that many people are finding themselves in today. One more major change that we're seeing is income inequality in the American dream. We are seeing a greater income and wealth gap in our country than we have ever seen. This is a statistic from the Pew Research Center. It's a couple years old now, but the trends definitely still hold, that the highest earners are steadily bringing in the largest share of the country's total income. And when you put wealth on top of it, it just goes even more astronomical. So this has always been an issue for us in this country, but the gap is significantly increasing. Since the recession in 2008, the rich have gotten richer, the poor have gotten poorer, and the middle class has shrunk. We're the first generation in many years where our children will likely not be better off financially than we are. And still, we have in our DNA the American dream, where if you work hard, you can make a good life, and rags to riches stories. And immigration data certainly suggests that that narrative is alive and well and compelling in the world today. So, and the reason I bring this up is that when this is the reality for the majority of people in our country, it matters a great deal what the church is doing in its traditional role to help protect and support people and families. It matters how we are conceiving of money. It matters whether we are being generous and how we are seeking justice in the world. That is a real impact the church has traditionally played in community and needs to continue to play today. So a quick recap here. Enlightenment values have narrowed our ways of knowing to the exclusion of faith. Culture is no longer propping up the church, and we've got these major cultural shifts that are undermining our traditional ways of being the church. So we are not in Kansas anymore, and we're not going to get to go back. We're going to have to find new ways. The theologian Stacy Johnson quotes the Apostle Paul saying, "There are two ways that we know of living as Christians. We can live as those who are perishing or as those who are being saved." And obviously, he's challenging us to choose not to be stuck in the nostalgia of what has been, or even the gratitude for what has been, but challenging us to think, what is God's Spirit doing now? How are we being saved? And how can we share that salvation with the world? So I would argue that we are in a new kind of Reformation moment in this country and in our faith. Scholars who've been tending to this much longer and more in depth than I have say that we are experiencing an upheaval as significant as the Protestant Reformation. Diana Butler-Bass has done a lot of work on this, Phyllis Tickle, Harvey Cox, Ted Smith from Candler. And Diana Butler-Bass has talked specifically about religious awakenings as some of what is happening in the country right now, that we're undergoing another religious awakening. And she says this about them: "They are the most vital and yet most mysterious of folk arts, periods of cultural revitalization that begin in a general crisis of belief and values." That sounds familiar, right? "Extends over at least a generation, during which time a profound reorientation in beliefs and values takes place." She's arguing that's what we're going through right now, and I think there's a lot of evidence to support that. And when we're undergoing that kind of major transition, it's very easy to get stuck, because we simply do not know what that profound reorientation is going to be. And so it's hard to get where you're going when you can't see where you're headed, right? And we also have some well-loved things that we say in the church that help keep us stuck. We say, "We've always done it that way," or its cousin, "We've never done it that way." I think the last 18 months have helped rid us of some of that, because we've just been forced to try new things and do things in new ways. And in reality, the form of church has always been changing. The church of today does not look like the church of Jesus' day, or the church of 400 years after that, or 400 years after that. And mostly the forms of church that we have today are post-World War II forms of church. So it is very possible for us to reform it once again. So maybe we are in the midst of this profound reorientation of beliefs and values. Ted Smith at Candler calls it, we're living in the time between the times. We don't yet know what is to come, but we know we can't go back to what has been. So what do we do? This is the part of the class where I'm going to give you the 10 easy steps to navigate all this cultural change. I wish I could. But what I will do is share some observations and some key shifts that we're seeing in the church. And in this, I'm going to mash up some wisdom from these three folks. Tim Shapiro and Kara Ferris have done some great studies for the Lilly Endowment, looking at congregations who are thriving. Ron Byers, I mentioned that book that he has written. And then Dr. Roger Nishioka has been doing a lot of work looking at the trends, particularly among young adults, and how the cultural shifts are shifting the way young adults engage with the church. So I'm going to use Tim Shapiro and Kara Ferris' kind of outline of how we need to be changing and how congregations are thriving amidst the change, and then add in Dr. Byers and Dr. Nishioka's wisdom into that. So the first thing that the Lilly Endowment's research has shown for thriving congregations is that thriving congregations recognize their changing social and cultural contexts. Secondly, they exhibit clarity of values and mission. And thirdly, they cultivate Christian practices. Now, I don't know about you, but I read that list and I kind of go, okay, that doesn't feel like that should be outside of the realm of what we can do. That feels doable to me. But so let's take some time to unpack what this means. So this first one, recognizing there's changing social and cultural contexts. Thriving congregations are exhibiting a nuanced understanding of the characteristics, interests, history, and challenges of their specific communities and neighborhoods. They attend closely to demographic and social changes in their communities and seek to understand the roots of those changes. And they're active participants in the community, not expecting people to come to them, but actively participating in the work of the community. So some of the things that these are primarily from Roger Nishioka, that he is challenging us to do are to shift from mission being somewhere out there in a different part of the world even. There's still significant mission to be done in multiple parts of the world, so don't mishear me there. But to also be really serious about what mission needs to happen right here in our very neighborhoods, on our very blocks, with the people we interact with every day. What effect do we have on our neighborhood? I had a colleague ask me a few years ago, or I guess he was reflecting for himself, and he said, what I really hope that we can shape my church into is a church where if we went away, our neighbors would say, I don't know what our community is going to do. That haunts me, because I'm afraid that for most of our congregations, if we went away, most of our neighbors wouldn't notice, except they might see a new development come on our property. So I don't know what this community would do without your church. I think that needs to be one of our goals. The second shift is the shift away from discipleship and toward apostleship. And what he means by that is a very specific kind of movement that we have often said, come to us. Come be here with us. We'll open our doors, 9 o'clock Sunday morning, you come in, we'll form you, we'll have worship, then you'll go out, it's all good, we'll have youth group in the evening, all this kind of attractional model of Christianity. And he's pushing us toward an apostleship model, apostles being the sent out ones. So we are, as the church, needing to be the sent out ones. That's where we'll do the apostleship work and the discipleship work, is out in other places. That we are on a mission of God and need to be out in the world on that mission. I don't think we've really cracked what this looks like yet. I haven't seen really great images of this, but I think it needs to be in the forefront of our mind, because often I think what we're doing, even when we are out there doing missional kinds of activities, secretly we're hoping to just lure people back into the building. And we really need to let that go and figure out what would it mean to be out serving. How can we be forming people out in the world, not just when we're here together? And again, I think the pandemic has perhaps helped us with that. in terms of thinking about ways that the church, we don't have to gather here in order to be the church in the world. So we need to keep mining those learnings. The next shift is to move from high tech to high touch. There's so much research out there right now on how isolated and lonely people are in the world today. And that's, interestingly, a lot of the scholars are saying a product of the information age that we're living in, that sense of overwhelm we talked about earlier, and high tech mediating a lot of our experiences, and we're forgetting how to then act in community, how to be connected in meaningful ways, how to have high touch kinds of ministries. And this is good news for us because, like church, we got this one, right? We know how to do high touch. We know how to set up meals when someone's having stir family. We know how to show up with a prayer shawl, to pray with people, to check in on them. We know how to do these things. Our family has been really surprised and grateful for the church that we've attended before I started at Georgetown, that several times over the course of the pandemic, the deacons would just show up with flowers for us because I had surgery last year. My mother-in-law, the anniversary of her death, they remembered that and brought us flowers that Sunday. When I started the new job at Georgetown, they dropped off flowers, and it was just so wonderful to be thought of. It connected us in a really way much more deeply than I expected those flowers to do. So those high touch kinds of things have a lot of power in the world right now. And the last shift that he's arguing for us in this category is to shift from reasons-filled spirituality to mystery-filled spirituality. And I think this is getting back to some of that enlightenment, precognition versus precognition kinds of ways of knowing. And again, we don't need to abandon reason, that's a good thing, but also to let ourselves be infused with the mystery and the intuition and the emotional part of our faith. Mystery, awe, and wonder need to be key in who we are and who we're becoming. The second piece here, to exhibit clarity of values and mission. Shapiro and Ferris talk about this, and thriving congregations have striking clarity about their values and mission. They draw on their theological and ecclesial tradition. They develop a strong sense of identity and are able to articulate why they're called to love God and to serve, and why the activities they do and carry out are connected to that bigger picture. They identify specific areas of interest and then align their ministries and activities around those priorities. They're not merely concerned with the roles and functions of sustaining the church and its programs, but instead are focused on a vision of abundant life that connects them to God, one another, and the world. So in this, Dr. Byers would say one of the first things we need to really get serious about is embracing discipleship as the goal, the thing we are trying to do. We're not trying to get disciples. That is what we're doing, and we need to stay focused on that as the why of what we're doing, and evaluating our programs and our activities on that. So how many times have we had a conversation that goes something like, oh yeah, Wednesday night supper was great. There were like 50 people there. What does that actually tell us? 50 people got dinner, that's good. But other than that, that doesn't say hardly anything about the content of the event. So thinking about how we're planning our activities, how we're talking about them, how we're evaluating them, to make sure that discipleship is the goal here. Secondly, shifting from mass evangelism to one-on-one evangelism. Dr. Nishioka tells the joke, you may have heard this one, what do you get when you cross a Jehovah's Witness with a Presbyterian? Someone who knocks on the door and has nothing to say. So teaching people how to talk about Jesus in their daily lives, in our daily lives, so that we are out in the world, being those apostles sent out, speaking about our faith and having clarity of the values and mission that we're about, so that when there's an opportunity, that we're ready to respond. Dr. Byers notes in his book that we are occasionally asked as Christians, why do you go to church? And most of us don't have a great answer. Certainly not a compelling or winsome one. It's usually something like, well, I was raised Presbyterian, or I like the people there. That's not going to motivate anyone to come with you or to come check out what this is that we're doing here and the gift it can be for your life. So thinking deeply about, are we ready for that kind of one-on-one evangelism where we're really going to be able to have an impact? The next shift is to move from long-term planning to short-term planning. I love a good plan. One of my jobs at Georgetown is the long-term strategic plan. So this is a challenge, but to be thinking together about how agile we need to be in our society right now. Again, the pandemic has taught us a lot about this, because we can make plans today for what will happen next weekend, and then something will happen and we got to shove all those plans out and start over. So how are we thinking about more short-term, 1 year, 5 year, even 6 month, kind of what are we going to try to do in this season, in this time, and start from there. So I think the immediate context right now is helping us with this one. And again, we don't need to not attend to the longer range, but pay more attention to the shorter range because things are changing so quickly. The next shift here is to relearn how to deal with serious theological questions. People are asking, particularly in the last 2 years, with the racial unrest in this country, with the pandemic, with this economic inequality. I mean, people are asking big theological questions with climate change. There are big questions on people's minds. And Dr. Byers would argue that we're no longer answering them specifically. We've lost in that kind of watering down, he talks about, of religious skepticism, that we've lost our ability to deal with people's very serious theological questions. And I think some of that is shifting some of our mindset to how are we engaging people with the questions that they are actually bringing with them when they come to church or when we're meeting them out on the street and in the world. We've become so programatized in our work that we often are offering programs like, come do a Bible study on the Gospel of Matthew, which is a great gospel. We should read it. We should learn from it. But that's not a question that keeps me up at night, and probably not you either, and definitely not people who are not reared in faith. But if we're thinking about, my mother's dying of cancer, and I don't know how to reconcile that with a good world, that's keeping me up at night. That's not true for me right now in my life, but an example of what are people actually wrestling with. And our faith has all kinds of resources to speak exactly to those questions. How are we doing that? How are we engaging those serious theological questions? We have some young adults who live next door to us, and we had them over for dinner. This was pre-pandemic, but they were over for dinner, and I was preaching the next day and needed to get back upstairs and finish my sermon, and they said, "Oh, what are you preaching?" And I kind of mumbled like, "Oh, it's a story from Mark's gospel," and da-da-da. And then I realized they were serious. They were asking. They wanted some morsel, and I blew it off. I missed the moment. I have a yoga teacher who I was speaking with about a year ago. Her mother-in-law was dying, and she was talking about accompanying her in that dying. And luckily, that time, I realized, oh, she's asking some very serious theological questions right now, and I need to stay present here. Not that I have the answers, but at least not miss the moment of what's going on, and that I do, in my faith tradition, have some things, some wisdom to bring to this. So pay attention to where there's serious theological questions coming up and not missing the moment there. Lastly on this one, shifting from credential leadership to gifted leadership. And this is getting at, we have spent a lot of time and energy, and this is, again, we're not saying throw out the baby with the bathwater here, but we've spent a lot of energy on making sure everyone has the credentials they need to be in leadership in the church. And when we do that, when we focus only on, have you been to seminary, have you learned Greek, have you learned Hebrew, have you passed ordination exams, we're missing a lot of gifted leaders out in the congregation and definitely out in the community who have a lot that they can teach us about what it means to be a follower of Jesus Christ. So how are we paying attention not only to the credentials of leadership, which I do think we still need, but also to the gifts that are in abundance around us and need to be part of building up the church today, particularly because often those of us who have the credentials have been so traditioned in the way of thinking the way the church has been that we're not as good at seeing the possible connections, the possible apostleship opportunities. Whereas those who are grassroots grown and leading in that way have much more of an ability right now to find the connections, to be tuned into what those serious theological questions are, and to help us then bring the fullness of our tradition to it. Okay, the third and last mark that Ferris and Shapiro note in thriving congregations are that they're cultivating Christian practices. Thriving congregations concentrate their attention on living out their common life and mission through time-honored Christian practices. Common examples include hospitality, testimony, Sabbath rest, and singing. They attend to these practices in ways that are contextual for their ministry settings and rooted in the particularities of their particular tradition. They cultivate a rich sense of community as they help individuals identify with the congregation and the experience of belonging through shared vocabulary and engagement in common rituals and activities. So Dr. Nishioka talks about this as a shift from tribal education to immigrant education. 60% of people in our congregations today were not born and raised Presbyterian. That's a lot of immigrants to our particular brand of faith. And 15% of those were not churched at all. So there are people among us who simply don't know us. So how are we thinking about cultivating those practices and teaching those practices in multivalent ways? Second, spiritual formation needs to be done via teachable moments. And again, this gets back to engaging those serious theological questions again, that more and more often we're not going to see people going through graded Sunday school programs to get every benchmark of faith along the way as they grow up. We're going to see more impact when we have in our community that we can bring to bear our resources. This is a challenge for us because it's a lot harder to figure out how do you program for teachable moments rather than sort of the planned out curriculum that we're used to. But I see this happening, just in the daily life of the church, that it's hard to get people to find the time and the energy to engage program after program around education. But we're all the time making decisions about, like at Georgetown, we were just talking about changing our bank and who our banker is. Well, that's a really good moment to stop and talk about what are our values around money and who do we want to be in the community, and therefore who do we want to bank with. There's some really important, I think, things that our tradition and scriptures teach us about that. But that's probably never going to be a Sunday school class, right? It's going to be in the session meeting, in those committee meetings, bringing to bear those teachable moments. So pausing when we have those to engage us again in getting back to the Christian practice of generosity, of justice, those kinds of things. Thirdly, to rewrite job descriptions that favor teaching and mentoring. We have adopted so many corporate values in the church and so many corporate ways of structuring ourselves, particularly since World War II. How can we get back to teaching and mentoring, accompanying people in faith as the main thing that leaders in the church are doing? At the church in Fairfax, we were having all kinds of trouble with children's ministry. Just the numbers kept declining, and we tried everything we could to figure out how to respond to it with new curriculum and all kinds of gimmicks, none of which worked. And finally we said, okay, this is not working. We took a summer and we talked to every family in the church, either individually or in small groups, and asked parents and kids, what is it that you value about having your child raised in faith and having them connected to the church? And everyone said, I want my kid to have other trusted adults who can know them, and walk with them and essentially apprentice them in faith. So all of our, and I can tell you that most of my time had been spent on things like, my kids don't like the snack in Sunday school. That's a very different problem than I want adults for my kids to walk with my kids in faith. So we totally shifted. I mean, our program didn't look that different after this summer of listening, but we shifted our emphases to, okay, how are we recruiting teachers and leaders in our children's ministry and teaching them that their job is to know these kids and to walk with them and to share their own faith stories. So it's a nuanced kind of shift. I don't think it's going to radically change what our programs look like, what our activities look like, but where are we placing the emphasis? And the last one here is recovery of word and Eucharist. That's probably not surprisingly from Dr. Byers, who is my preaching and worship professor, that he will always think that's one of the answers here. But I think in the fullness of what we mean in proclaiming the good news, in sharing the good news and sharing the word of Christ in the world, and then in practicing together the sacraments, and particularly in the Eucharist, the remembering of the story of our faith, and the sharing of bread in the community. How are we doing those things? How are we re-emphasizing the best and the richness of our traditions? So those are your 3 easy steps for shifting into this new world. None of this is easy, friends, but I think it is the faithful work ahead of us. Our Book of Order talks about the calling of the church to be a community of faith, hope, love, and witness in and for the world. And I suspect that key to a life of faithfulness in this Reformation time between the times, that it will be key for us to hold this true, that our church is to be a community of faith, entrusting itself to God alone, even at the risk of losing its life. The forms of church that we know will radically change over the course of the next generation, and as much as these forms have nurtured us, it's also good for them to change. Our call may be to graciously let the old things go and pass away so that God's new things might come into being. To live not for ourselves, but for the faithfulness of God, for the sake of the world that God loves so much. And I just want to leave you with one story. We had a visitor at church who came for the first time with her young children, and she was new to Christianity. I was chatting with her after the service and getting to know her a little bit. And then she said, kind of timid, "Can I ask you something about what happened in the service?" I said, "Of course." She said, "You said at one point, in Jesus Christ, our sins are forgiven." And I looked around, and nobody seemed surprised. "But if that's true," she said, "that's the best news I've ever heard." It stopped me cold. We have something of great value, and I pray that we will learn how to adapt and how to share it in meaningful ways for this time and this generation and this time between the times, because the world desperately needs it. Thank you.